Welcome to today's VentureBeat webinar, Power Up Your Analytics. I'm Evan Schuman. Before we jump into today's topic, a few quick housekeeping details. Nothing too stressful. First of all, we'd like to ask everyone to enable pop-ups on your browser. We're going to have different information, some slides, some polls, and other things, so that'll help you see that. Obviously, please make sure that your headphones are turned on or that you're using the system speakers to hear the presentation. Although if you're hearing my voice, then you've already done that. So everything will stream through your browsers. Okay, so we will be asking for audience questions today, and questions and comments can be made by hitting the Ask a Question button. It's at the top of the web console. We're also going to be doing instant polls today. So you'll also, the polls will crop up, you will see them, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions there. If there's a technical issue, if you can't hear something or something is going wrong, if you click Help and submit the question, we're going to see that as well. So that's a good way to give us a heads up that something is wrong. You're also going to be able to download a copy of the slides today in the Attachments tab. So if you go up there, you'll be able to get a copy of what we're going to be presenting today. And also a reminder that we're going to be making this available to watch again on demand. So you'll be able to listen to the webinar again on demand by going back to this location. So appreciate the efforts there. There is little doubt that IT today has access to far more data than ever. To the extent that the goal is to deliver the most accurate answers, that's helpful. To the extent that the goal is to deliver faster answers, it's a mixed bag. And the fact that we're gathering more data may not necessarily deliver better answers. It really depends on whether the right data is being gathered, given the answers we're seeking and the questions we're wrestling with. If it's not the right data, then much of the information is little more than noise that our analytics need to deal with. But how do you make sure that you're capturing the right data for analytics? And how do you, beyond collecting the right data, how do you figure out what the best way is today to crunch that data and what no longer makes sense? To try to figure all this out today, we turn to today's panel of analytics superheroes. We have Ross Bixler, Director of Business Operations at Underground Elephant. We have got Robert Olson, Director of Data and Analytics for DigitalOcean. We have got also Andrew Searson, Director of Analytics over at Looker. And we also have our very own John Sequentes, Analyst for VentureBeat. So we're going to be trying to figure all this out. Before we do that, I wanted to ask Andrew, can you help us just set the stage a little more by looking at some of the analytics challenges, issues, and what you see out there today?
Yeah, sure. So typically, when it comes to analyst requests, they come in a couple of forms. I would say a lot of requests sometimes come in via testing. They want to know some sort of causal testing. But I'd say most of them are actually kind of off the cuff, answer some questions for me. I want to look at some numbers. And a lot of the time that those kind of off-the-cuff time requests take a bit of time. And so with Looker, the company I work for, we have a BI platform that allows us to answer those questions fairly quickly. And actually, it kind of enables business users and users who are typically analysts to answer them for themselves. So we facilitate this entire kind of analytics organization from people who are not necessarily analysts.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. So, Robert, I was hoping you could give us a bit of a deep dive into some of the analytics discoveries that you've made over at DigitalOcean.
Yep, definitely. So I'm going to try to advance here. Really happy to dive in and look at basically how DigitalOcean was able to basically take what was a very disconnected, disparate set of data systems and really turned them into something that was providing real value to our business. So a little bit of an overview. DigitalOcean has scaled over the past 4 years since we were founded to really reaching, a huge number of individual developers around the globe from every country in the world. About 700,000 developers are on the platform using us for their cloud computing needs. We manage 13 physical data centers around the world in 7 different countries. We've launched over 14 million individual cloud servers, and that's at a rate of about 50,000 launching every day now. And so to go along with that, we're actually actively managing a huge fleet of physical infrastructure and hardware with varying configurations among the hardware and the software. So this whole team, the whole infrastructure team, was really built from the ground up to support this huge demand. But at the same time, we were needing to figure out how to combine sort of a huge amount of different types of data. So our main task here in any infrastructure team is really trying to figure out how you accurately sync the demands that you're seeing from your customers and the supply that you have on hand. And so, as a technology company, we're a little bit different in that we are managing physical assets in the real world that are needing to be there ready and on demand for when our customers want to spin up. So our broader infrastructure team really, comprises a lot of different types of functions, from platform engineering, network engineering, actual, on-the-ground data center operations, as well as sort of supply chain management, procurement, purchasing of all this infrastructure. And so that data that really builds the whole picture of balancing and forecasting and understanding how we're going to meet the demand of our customers and make sure we're always there with the supply for them, that data comes in so many different types of forms and really scattered across really a lot of different systems. And so when we set out as sort of a much younger, much more scrappy company, we were dealing with all different types of data on the supply side. We were looking at all the different, the size of the server fleet, how efficiently we were packing in our customers on servers based on their varying demands. All of this amount of stranded capacity, unavailable capacity due to technical issues, or due to basically inefficiencies in the scheduling system. And also, types of data around the supply chain, operational lead times. How do I get, all those assets to the right place and installed and live for our customers? And on the demand side, you're balancing a lot of different type of sort of more traditional data around how fast are you acquiring new customers, how fast are your existing customers expanding or contracting their usage. On DigitalOcean, you can rapidly expand and scale out, or rapidly contract and shrink the amount of infrastructure you're using in a matter of minutes. And so understanding all those dynamics is really complex and a key part to understanding the demand of our customers. And so, the real challenge was, we had developed these different teams that were all, a part of the greater infrastructure department. They were all trying to help each other make sure that we had this supply and demand in sync. But, we ran into this sort of distributed analysis challenge where, each team, the platform team, network, data center operations, supply chain, and actually a few other teams, they were all, from day one tapping into just the data sources they needed. They were figuring out how to get the data for their individual piece of the puzzle. And then there at the bottom, everyone had their own set of reporting tools. Everyone had their own, ways of defining certain metrics. Everyone was building a really different and sort of siloed context of the business. And then we would come together and have a challenge trying to incorporate all of that data into what the bigger story was and how we can actually make bigger changes to the entire operation rather than just sort of minor granular changes within a certain function. So the problems with that are, we had a lack of ability to really test hypotheses. Without the connected data across these different functions, we couldn't ask a bigger question. There was not a really good shared understanding of how all this data connected. Everyone sort of knew about their own, the data that was relevant just to them, but not so much how it connected to everything else. Hard to ask and answer those cross-functional questions. Everyone was using different definitions, different terminology that they had developed while tapping into their specific data set. And that's just, it's inefficient, it's confusing, and so data-driven action in that environment is difficult. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. And so understanding when that challenge arises and sort of acknowledging it was a big part of our growth as a company. And so you can see here just, so many different systems, so many different reporting mechanisms. We had everything from, raw query outputs to Excel files, pivot tables, back-end monitoring systems, nice colorful graphs, and everyone was bringing their own data to the table, but from so many different places that it was hard to sort of digest it all together and get the bigger story. So, our solution and a common solution when, you find yourself facing this challenge is really, trying to find a way to centralize the data that your business has access to really empower people to make decisions. And so when you succeed at centralizing and connecting that data and getting people a broader overview of the data that impacts the more, broad overarching goal for the business, it makes it really a lot easier to test hypotheses that span business groups. If we acquire more customers in this country, how is that going to affect the lead time for our supply chain out of this distributor? Different types of data all getting connected together. It also really is beneficial in that it constantly, different people throughout the business are immersed in this connected data, and that really builds the context for people who used to live more in silos. They start learning about how the data they're generating, how the data they're looking at really connects to different parts of the business. And that just builds this really rich context and makes our discussions and planning a lot more rich. Those cross-functional questions just sort of start to arise organically. They're not forced. When people are confronted with how their data impacts someone else's decision making and data flow, we start getting a lot more of those a lot more of that cross pollination and these types of bigger, more overarching questions. And of course, it mandates that you're sharing definitions, data models, terminology, and so everyone's talking the same language and tapping into the same central source of data. It just really increases the efficiency of the conversation and the planning. So all of that together really makes the overarching goal of data-driven action a lot easier. So for us, what that looked like was we took what used to be data on our users from one system, our financial data from another system, operational data, supply chain data, hardware data, software data that were in so many different systems, so many different formats, and weren't previously visible to anyone other than the people on that specific team. And we were able to combine them through Looker into a centralized system. And what we ended up finding to be the way to really empower people to make decisions with the data is really to abstract away all of the sub-metrics. With your user data or your financial data, you might have individual metrics that just relate to that specific function or that specific data set. But when you're able to connect all of the data together in a centralized location, you can start rolling up all of those individual pieces into more of a calculated, abstracted KPI that someone can use to actually make a decision. So, what I've depicted here is a KPI that really relates to how many weeks of runway do we have left in a data center before we would run out of capacity? And we determined as a team to manage to within that sort of red and green boundaries as sort of what we would like on an optimal basis. But instead of looking at trying to talk about the speed with which our customers are expanding or the lag time for a certain distributor's hardware infrastructure, or talking about any of these individual metrics and trying to piece them all together, when you roll them all up into sort of this bigger overarching goal metric, and that's enabled through something like Looker, you actually have a really simple way to think about the decision you're having to make, and really managing all of that more complex question becomes a lot easier. And so what that meant for us was, we've derived real business value from that, from combining that, all those different types of data, and really getting people, the decision makers, to focus on more of a roll-up metric, and leaving sort of the really granular analysis, to different forums rather than sort of the more strategic discussion. So we had a more precise understanding of what's driving our demand. We can very easily hone in and drill down into changes that we see much more efficient supply chain and, a reduction in our sort of stranded and technically unavailable capacity in our 13 data centers around the world. And all that, really boils down to real business value, which I think is something that every data team, at the end of the day has to justify, their existence through a real payoff for the business for that investment. And so for us, we've drastically been able to improve just the margins with which we can manage a large physical fleet of infrastructure. And that's it for our DigitalOcean case study.
Excellent. Thank you. We're going to get back into a lot of this in our discussion format a little bit later. But before we get into that, I did want to ask Russ, can you give us some of your takes from basically from Underground Elephant's perspective?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. This is Ross down here in San Diego with Underground Elephant. I actually recognize several of the similarities these present and the way that we use Looker. Primarily, the most important thing that gives us the ability to leverage Looker to its fullest potential is centralizing our data from disparate systems into one reporting system that Looker can help us produce insights from across all those platforms. We've got about 10 that we manage here at Underground Elephant. We're a marketing technology company, and we have several consumer and business-facing platforms that we have in web applications. And those disparate systems really need to speak to each other and come together for us to be able to do this really important function that we do get at Underground Elephant, which we lovingly call bug hunting. Bug hunting is effectively trying to figure out how the platforms are performing in ways that we don't expect. Sometimes those bugs are benign and they don't really have any impact on the bottom line. But sometimes those bugs are huge and they are sucking the life right out of our profits, and we have to find them. So one of the ways we do that is I actually pasted here a quick little screenshot from some of the LookML that we actually have baked in to Looker. And we can define these types of errors that you see on the screen, these error types that actually look both within one of our systems and then also across systems because we centralize all the data in one location. And they allow us to define these really specific cases in which we know that something's not functioning correctly. These are called unit tests sometimes, but the challenge is that we have such a limited resources in terms of who can actually look at the outcome of these tests, that we really need to utilize a tool like Looker to provide as many people as possible visibility into our system. So we really heavily leverage the abilities of Looker to provide the entire team, not just the BI staff that develops the architecture, but to provide the entire company access to the data that they need to be able to help us find these bugs. I have one really poignant example that was one of our really big bugs. One of the challenges that we have here at Elephant is that we're sort of a matchmaking company. We find data and we need to match it with orders from people that request that information. And so that matchmaking process, the matchmaking algorithm, often has hiccups in it. And we found one bug that that ended up really inhibiting our ability to grow. So we were doing all right for a couple of months, up to like month 8, month 9, and then things started to drop off. You'll see on the chart. And that really inhibited our ability to scale what we expected to be a nice growth trajectory. But because we had Looker and we had dozens of employees actually looking at the information, we found this really large bug in the matchmaking algorithm from someone who's not even what you would consider sort of a business intelligence analyst or anyone that would normally find these types of problems. Instead, their intuition from the simplicity of the definitions that we provided in the architecture inside Looker allowed them to understand how something really simple was stopping us from really maximizing our growth potential. So when we found that bug, we were able to squash it within that month 12 you see there, and our growth trajectory skyrocketed afterwards. So that's just one of the ways in which we utilize Looker to really produce immediately actionable items that can impact the bottom line pretty quickly.
Andrew, is there anything you wanted to add to that before we jumped into the discussion?
I guess I could put some color to that a bit. So Looker, given that it's a BI platform, it basically lets people access information. What it does is it allows you to pivot and look at stuff easily, where it might take the typical analyst a significant amount of time to pull that information. So it's not surprising that we could find these types of things quickly and action on them easily, just due to the nature of the way the platform works. One thing that is actually really interesting from our perspective is that what you find is, like something like this request before when it came to the bugs, was that you'll actually run off, an analyst will run off and they'll take this request and say, hey, we got a problem here. We need to figure it out. And so there'll be a hypothesis. That hypothesis will come down from somebody like a C-suite level and say, hey, let's figure out what this is. And the analyst will run off and kind of try and work or trying to confirm or deny that hypothesis. They'll come back with some sort of information. Then the asker of the request will say, this is kind of what I wanted, not so much. Can you run off and can you give me something else? And so you'll kind of go through these iterations over and over and over again. And typically without some sort of a tool that's pulling this for you quickly, you run into a situation where you're spending a significant amount of time trying to answer kind of a simple question. With Looker, you have the ability to pivot immediately. You can literally sit down with a person and say, or that person themselves can sit down and say, let's ask a question, let's pivot, let's ask a different question. And you're going to answer basically any avenue you want to on the fly right there with all the core logic that all the business users that are currently using that has been confirmed by the analyst at the time. So this idea of pulling information is great, but it's also pulling information quickly and accurately. And it's just really simple via the UI that we typically use. So it makes sense that this stuff was actually coming together pretty fluidly.
No, excellent. Let me throw a quick question over to Robert. When you were talking earlier, you were talking about one of the challenges that you had faced was the inability to easily and reliably test hypotheses as the analytics were proceeding. Can you offer any examples of particular challenges where there was something trying to be tested and it couldn't do it? Any scenarios you ran into?
Yeah, so I think really early on, one of the key things was trying to diagnose when something bad happened, right? When you're running at 1,000 miles an hour and trying to scale your business, you don't have a lot of time for things that aren't, mission critical. And so what we would early on find ourselves having, issues with is trying to understand, wow, for a few minutes there, in one of our data centers, we actually ran out of capacity. We had people trying to spin up servers and they couldn't because we didn't have enough room for them. And how could that have happened, and trying to diagnose the reasons for that. And so, before we had this sort of connected data set that people started thinking about things more broadly, we had, everyone trying to dive into their own piece of the chain and trying to say, what went wrong in my piece, right? And just looking at their confined data set that only they had access to. And that didn't yield a lot of insight and really didn't enable us to really fix the issue. When we started bringing the data together, we started being able to ask questions and test hypotheses. So one of our hypotheses was we may have a new type of use case for the product, a new type of user who will come on and spin up a very, very large amount of servers for a very short period of time, such that if we don't capture that, that very small spike in our sort of forecasting algorithms, we would be unable to incorporate sort of this sort of standard deviation that we would want to allow for in terms of the capacity we're allowing. And so the hypothesis we were able to test was, are these types of users actually impacting our ability to, have a really 100% available platform? And that question was previously not able to be really efficiently answered because you would need data from our traditional BI systems about our users to understand the types of users who were signing up, what actions they were taking on the platform, as well as the actual back-end hardware data that comes in a very large sort of raw streaming feed to understand understand where were these errors occurring, when were they occurring, which users were triggering them. So even the simplest question of being able to tie that user activity at the high level down to the technical data that was being issued by our back-end systems, those types of questions weren't able to be tested because we didn't have an integrated system where you could ask those broad questions that really tap into a lot of different types of data and a lot of different systems that we had going.
I wanted to get a similar sense, because you talked about cross-functional, and that a lot of those connections, if you will, cropped up organically. Can you give any examples of how that worked? And I wanted to follow up, but can you give me examples of how you saw these cross-functional connections kick in?
Yeah, definitely. And so, a team like an infrastructure team is going to have everyone from finance involved, our business analysts involved, all the way down to our software engineers, our hardware engineers, the people who are on the ground at the data centers actually doing the grunt work to actually install and get these systems up and running. And so what I saw was in our sort of weekly syncs between these, really broad range of functions, we went from a place where each individual function was sort of, giving their spiel about what they were working on, what issues they were addressing, kind of falling on dead ears, to, a place where we were asking these broader questions and these, anyone, a specific example would be someone from our finance team would start asking about specific errors that they were seeing in the data where we were, ending up stranding some of our capacity due to certain errors on some of our, our physical servers out in our data centers. And so the fact that someone from our finance team was learning and being able to diagnose and ask about these really, really specific technical failures, simply because they were surfaced through a really easy system like Looker, where they were actually able to dive in and say, I thought we had more capacity than this in this data center, drill down, see that it was classified as a certain error type, and actually start asking these questions. You get so many more eyes on the data, and you get so many more people with a much more rich, broad business context that you're able to have these questions pop up from people who otherwise would have been siloed in looking at just their subset of the broader picture.
What's really interesting about that is it's not what is traditionally perceived as an analytics role. In other words, it is analytics, but you're also enabling and facilitating communication. People are going to see patterns they wouldn't have otherwise seen from different departments. So it does a lot more than you traditionally would expect.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the keys here is not only empowering your BI team or your analysts, but really empowering the rest of the organization not only to have access to the data, but to be able to explore that data in a simple and intuitive way. Not only will that allow them to diagnose and see, where things in their department are going awry or going well, it just builds a much more rich, more broad business context for everyone involved. People who are down in the nitty-gritty of the technical data are starting to see patterns and implications on the financial side and vice versa, and all these cross-functional sort of stories start being told and understood by people in all areas of the business. So I think that business context is such a value for a product like this and for building a team in a way where you can get everyone to start seeing, pieces from the entire, bigger picture and building that context.
John, let me pull you in here for a moment. I still find it very intriguing in terms of the ability to allow different departments to see information they would simply never have likely noticed before. Do you see much potential for that in a variety of verticals?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing we noticed in doing tons of research in this area, talking with hundreds of companies, thousands of data analysts, we're starting to see kind of the wisdom of startups bleed into the enterprise. So, you think of a tech startup out here in Silicon Valley being very data-centric, having lots of departments close to the data just by way of culture, just kind of, that's how they were born, and that's how they were bred, and that's how they operate. A lot of companies don't do that. Most departments keep things siloed off, very little interoperability, very hard to generate actionable insights when data is living in different places. So, one thing we're starting to see is say, a large multinational brand, they'll have these sort of data deep dives at the beginning of every week where they'll invite various business leaders, various product line leaders from all different departments, and the data gets presented first. It's a 30-slide deck, an hour-long meeting, and the first 10 slides are about, here's all the interesting marketing data that happened last week, and here's how it impacts other areas of the business. What ideas do you guys have? Committee of leaders across the business, and that's another thing that we found interesting is when you bring the data together in different areas of the business like this, the business ideas that emerge, not just from data analysts but from leadership, can be really amazing.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, part of the problem here is you've got a corporate culture problem, particularly with larger enterprises, where they see data as proprietary, not just from competitors, but from other departments. And they are worried about people giving counsel and advice and interfering. So there's been traditionally a lot of fear of sharing the data beyond need to know, and that's depriving them of a lot of insights they could get by sharing it cross-functionally, as Robert's been talking about.
And I mean, that's still going to be an immovable wall in some industries. And, it's important to make sure culturally that people aren't optimizing for their function, but optimizing for the business. I think one good way to do that is to kind of have these broad committees where you invite leaders from a lot of different areas of the business to discuss the data.
I'd like to throw out a question in a moment. I'd like to throw out a question to the panel, taking this up a level, which is, when arguing to C-levels, how do you make the ROI, the return on investment argument, particularly with these kind of analytics? I'm going to go into that in a minute, but first, let's hear what the audience says. We're going to go to our first instant poll. So in theory, that is now being displayed in front of all of you, and you can vote now. But the question is, what have you found to be the biggest obstacles to your analytics efforts? So one, the budget pushback from above, C-levels and whatnot, budget pushback from other business units, having sufficiently clean data to analyze it initially, the inaccuracy of your current analytics software, and insufficient speed of your current analytics software. So while the audience is chewing on those options, let me just run it quickly by the panel for prediction as to what the audience is going to do. So let's start with John. What do you think the audience is going to choose as their biggest obstacle?
I'm not sure if we have a statistically relevant sample here, so it would just be a blind. I think it's going to be fairly evenly distributed. I think speed isn't so much an issue anymore, but accuracy, cleanliness, it could go really any direction here.
But I'm going to ask you to choose one. What do you think they're going to go for?
We'll go with door number one, but budget pushback from above.
Okay, budget pushback from C-levels. And Andrew, what is your take? What do you think the audience is going to go for? This is not necessarily your opinion, but what do you think the audience is going to go for?
Oh, I mean, it really depends on the business. I'd say if it's a big business, typically a lot of companies have a bunch of different BI tools. But if it's a smaller kind of EBT type thing, I guess I'd have to say, I'd have to say 3.
Having sufficiently clean data, that's their problem. Their data.
Yeah, that happens. Yeah, it's one of these things where, if you don't actually have a kind of a BI platform, you're actually getting information all over the place, and then you kind of don't know which one to use to make that decision. That happens kind of agnostic of the business you're in. So that's my thought.
And part of it, just to throw in a quick thought on that, part of it is perception. That at this point, if that's an obstacle that you're perceiving it to be insufficiently clean, depending on what you're using, it might be cleaner or less clean than you think. But the perception is that your data isn't solid enough, isn't consistent enough to
it takes one bad example to kind of ruin somebody's opinion of the data they're getting. It takes a long time to produce that kind of integrity and that stability there, and then you pulled one bad thing, and then so it's really good. That's actually becomes a kind of a big thing. In fact, I'll have requests where they'll have me pull it in 3 different ways just to make certain everything kind of ties. So,
Rob, what is your vote on what you think the audience is going to go for here?
I mean, I'm going to have to go with number 3, I think, as well. Various, depending on the company, you will have, various battles for budget, but I think sort of a more overarching hurdle that you'll run into is sort of like a version of number 3. So not just the cleanliness of the data, but the confidence and the trust from the rest of the business that they have the type of data and the sort of support structure involved in wrangling and transforming all of that data into a unified data set that they can trust and they can trust to take action on. And so it's sort of a combination of how do you justify the budget. You have to be able to argue that people are going to make different decisions than they would have without this platform. And in order to have people make decisions from the platform, they have to trust the information that it's giving. And so, overcoming the hurdle of wrangling the data from all these different systems, especially if you don't have sort of the data engineering or, technical capacity to, do it very quickly and get it up and running very quickly, that's what I see as a huge obstacle that's more sort of universally felt.
Ross, you get the final word here. Before we reveal, sir, what the audience has actually voted, what is your prediction as to where they're going to go?
Speaking from experience, I would guess number 1. Budget is really always the biggest challenge, getting enough resources to get enough data architects behind putting in a cohesive solution. That's been my experience in the past, and I find that the reason why you have disparate solutions for business analytics is because everyone is managing their scarcity. So I would guess number 1.
No, absolutely. And that's the reason we're going to go into the question afterwards in terms of how do you make the ROI case, because there may be an excellent ROI reason to do it, but that hasn't been articulated well. So let's take a look and see what we've got here. So the actual answer is we are going to take a look right now. Okay, so this is a lot more overwhelming than I had thought. 75% chose C, that their data was not sufficiently clean. That they found to be the biggest obstacle, followed way down with the inaccuracy of the current analytics software they are using. So we have not gotten from this particular audience many concerns about monetary, either from C-levels or from business units. So that's interesting. Would not have expected that. So let's talk about how you make that C-level ROI case. And let's start with John. What is the best way in terms of, with an analytics argument, how do you make that case, and what are most people doing ineffectively when they make that case? What's a better way to present it?
That's a good question. I think we're reaching a day and age where it's surprising that this problem exists. That executives are unwilling to invest in data and infrastructure. So I think you could ask some really snarky rhetorical questions like, do you want a better allocated budget? Do you want more accurate measure of channel performance? Do you want to know how your users or channels are interacting with one another? Do you want to, all that money you spend in brand and marketing, and do you want to know what it's doing, how to make better adjustments? Do you want to shorten time to conversion? Just the use cases for what analytics brings you, from an education standpoint for your business is just unbelievable. So it really depends on what kind of business you're in and what kind of education the executives need. But I think those are some baseline questions you could start from.
I mean, one of the issues when you get into that is that a lot of this is software, the analytics software dependent. In other words, if you've got a CFO usually one of the stingier C-levels. But if you have got a CFO who in a prior company had bad experience with the accuracy, the usefulness of the data because it wasn't extracting meaningful enough information, then you're going to get a lot more resistance because in their mind, they're going to equate analytics being the last package they had experience with. So it's sometimes you have to overcome bad information because, well, no, this is a very different system. So
tools is. I would just argue that tools is just kind of a small part of this. So yes, there needs to be kind of constant infrastructure investment. There needs to be a constant roadmap of improvements. It's never good enough, and you need to make sure that you're prioritizing that message. But you need to always be recruiting too, and not necessarily people from your particular vertical. One of the examples earlier where you found that kind of data deluge and you found that blip that really changed the business. You need to find those smart data scientists with a high level of what I'd call intelligent naivety. Someone who has the skills and is willing to learn. That's the most important thing.
Andrew, let me flip that last question. What is the most powerful resistance argument that you've heard C-levels give, and how do you get around that?
As far as an argument goes, I think it's more of kind of a lack of understanding of the pain points of the business. So if problems are bubbling up, most of the time it does come with, I don't have enough information, it's hard for me to get, I can't make accurate decisions based on what I have, or just a kind of accepting the status quo. So this is the amount of information I'm going to get and nothing more. If these pain points don't actually bubble up to the C-suite level, then a lot of times I think there's a small level of ignorance when it comes to that. And they say, hey, we don't really need it to somebody, a CFO or say even like a CEO that's asking for information. And the analytics org is kind of a black box and they send it back. There's no way for them to actually know, hey, look, something like Looker would be valuable. So the biggest pushback, I think, would be like, I don't know that we need it. How do I validate that we need this kind of thing, which is kind of the basis of the question. I think, to answer something like that, you'd kind of want to start posing some of the, hey, like, here's some of the issues that you're probably having. And that's tough. You don't want to go to a CEO and tell them you have issues, and here they are. Typically, they should be the ones to know that. So I can see that might be difficult to answer.
But Andrew, let's just pick up something from the survey we just did, which is if the C-level's fears are based on that her or his thoughts are that our data isn't clean enough, it's not consistent enough, we're not ready for top-level analytics because I don't think our data is good enough. How do you get around that? And in some cases, their fears are going to be warranted. How do you deal with that argument that we're not ready?
Yeah, well, we can display, in Looker the integrity of the data because the way it's managed because of the modeling of it. It's an easy use case to say, okay, you've got your top analysts here. They define the logic on how you're going to pull this information one time. And then the whole org is using that definition on how to pull that information. And that sometimes gives that confidence, like, oh, okay, this is now valuable. If that's the case is I'm concerned about the integrity of my information, then that's actually a really easy thing to demonstrate. You say, okay, hey, look, see this kind of UI that you've set up for anybody on your team here. They're going to be pulling this exact same metric every time. So when it comes to the integrity, it's a really simple and easy thing to demonstrate to the C-suite type.
Rob, I wanted to pull you into that discussion, but specifically the cross-functional point you made before. Is that a decent argument to make to C-level? In other words, pointing out some of the values that are not traditionally pure analytics, that it's going to help different parts of our company see other parts, and we're going to see opportunities where we simply wouldn't have noticed it.
Yeah, I think that is a very powerful sort of value proposition. Sort of when I think about this question of how do you really justify investment not only in the software but in the sort of headcount that you're going to need to support running that software effectively. I think some of the most powerful things to point to are really, especially someone like a CFO can relate to, are, like was just mentioned, these sort of single definition and single way of looking at something, that you will have consistency in the lens with which you evaluate the business, and so that can build trust. You could go in, depending on who you're talking to, and start talking about let's look at the way people are making decisions today and the types of data that they're using to make those decisions, and try to pinpoint some of the ways in which a few things may be happening. Maybe that data is not consistent across the business. People are using different metrics, different systems to try to pull the same views. Or it could also be that maybe that data just isn't seen as being objective. One of the things about having a centralized data environment managed by an objective team of data analysts is that, people are looking at data that it's very hard to get data in something like Looker to lie, right? And I think that, where we've come in the last sort of 5 to 10 years of looking at data is away from situations where each team is pulling and wrangling their own data to justify things they've done, and rather having data live in a more objective system where anyone can go in and look at it. And so it builds trust across the business, and it also builds that context. And so you can go to someone, any of the C-levels, and start a conversation about developing talent throughout the organization through developing this broader, more rich business context. Do you really want the people who are in, let's say, the most technical fields not really being exposed to your business acquisition metrics and your financial metrics, your user acquisition, any of these types of things? I think that's where startups are sort of leading the way, or have been leading the way, in pushing companies toward sort of data democracy and allowing people in any function to learn and be exposed to data and other functions, because you'll be very surprised where some of those insights can start coming from, some of those ideas that start from just having access and exposure to data that isn't particularly, maybe directly relevant to your day-to-day.
Are you still seeing, we talked earlier about the cultural resistance points. Are you seeing that with a lot of C-levels, that the idea of truly allowing cross-functional data sharing can scare some of them? Is that still an issue, or is that pretty much gone?
I think it really depends on the company and, frankly, on the individual person. Like someone alluded to earlier, there are individuals who have had bad experiences in the past. Maybe they were at a company where the data was not accurate or actionable, and so there was not that much value being derived from it. Maybe they were at a company where, traditionally in certain verticals, people don't share data. They see it as sort of this internal competition of competitive advantage within the company to have access to certain data points that another department may not have access to. It's sort of this defense mechanism to say, we really don't want anyone else, any prying eyes looking at the data coming out of our department, because who knows what they might find, and that scares us. We don't know what we haven't found ourselves. And I think it's really just a cultural shift for a company that, again, I think startups are leading the way here toward, really not having the capacity to build those walls. When you start as a very small, scrappy company, you don't, I don't think it's the most effective thing to start trying to decide who gets to view what information, who gets to have what knowledge, and what have you. So I think the barrier depends on the person and their prior experience and their views, but I think that overwhelmingly more companies and more companies that aren't young and aren't scrappy startups are starting to feel, and really see the value in allowing that data to be shared and centralized as a common resource across the business.
There's a very traditional IT perspective, which is the young, scrappier startups are going to have very little, if any, legacy. They're going to generally have more consistent systems, whereas a large, older enterprise is going to have systems inherited from acquisitions and all kinds of projects. So they likely are starting from a lot more disparate, incompatible systems. So there's an argument that forcing the data to be compatible in and of itself is a rather substantial value to the company. So Ross, let me ask you this. I wanted to pull you into this. What are you seeing as the biggest C-level concerns, and how do you deal with that? Ross? Looks like we may have lost Ross, so we will get back to Ross in just a moment. This is probably a good opportunity just for a moment to go to our second instant poll while hopefully we reconnect with Ross. And now the second instant poll question is, what have you found to be the biggest challenges to distributed analytics? So 1, the lack of ability to test hypotheses, which we talked about earlier, no shared understanding of how data connects, hard to ask or answer cross-functional questions, which is some of the cultural issues we've been talking about, and differing definitions and terminology leading to inefficiency and confusion. So, while the audience chews upon those interesting options, let's go back to our panel for predictions. And for lack of creativity, let's go in the same sequence. John, I'm going to ask you to jump on the hot seat again and make your prediction of how the audience is likely to vote on that. So what do you think they're going to do on this one?
No problem. I think it's somewhere in the bottom half of these questions. They're kind of the similar sides of a similar coin. So I'm going to go with 2, no shared understanding of how data connects.
Any particular reason for that?
I think, again, they're all related. So if you have disparate systems, it's going to be hard to answer or ask those cross-functional questions. If you have disparate systems, you're likely going to have different definitions of what the different markers are in those systems. So I think number 2 is kind of the overarching, 3 and 4 feel born out of question 2.
Makes sense. Andrew, how do you weigh in on this? What do you think they're going to do?
Yeah, so I agree. I think number 2. And this kind of goes back to some of the siloing type stuff. If you're in a certain department and you know your information really well, but you don't know another department's information, the only thing you're ever going to do, the only reference points you have to compare and say, to validate some other department's information is kind of your own. So you're looking for that, how do I connect my information to theirs so that I can kind of justify or validate that I agree that these kind of question that we're asking, this distributed analytics question is actually accurate. I think number 2 is probably the answer there.
So you're taking the philosophical approach. You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if you're grounded, if you're finance, you know your finance numbers, and you want to somehow connect it to some sort of support numbers, you're going to be looking for some sort of connection that says, okay, I have a grounding in my understanding of finance stuff. How does that relate to support? Do we have some sort of connection there? And if you find it, then you can say, okay, I can kind of justify believing this kind of cross-functional answer that I've created between these 2 departments. If you don't have that connection, though, then you just kind of don't trust it in general. So that's why I think how the data connects and not having an understanding of that is probably the limiter here.
Makes sense. Rob, how do you weigh in?
Alrighty, I'm going to go for number 2 as well. I think that it's very difficult, in terms of the challenges of a distributed sort of organization where everyone's just accessing and having a view of their own data. You just don't really, things don't click in your mind. If you're on a customer support team and you notice an increase maybe in a certain type of ticket being opened by your customers, or a general volume increase from somewhere, and you don't have access or really just a general knowledge of other data that's being pushed throughout the company, maybe marketing data, user acquisition data, it's not that you don't want to ask those questions and make those connections. You just don't have a good understanding, and your thought process isn't sort of structured to click in that way to start saying, oh, that makes sense because I saw this data from the marketing team that said we were doing this initiative last week that was going to spur a certain type of user, and that's probably where this is coming from. Those little connections just don't really happen, and so people they operate with the data they have, which is, restricted to basically their own system. And, it's very rare that these cause and effect type scenarios would ever be confined to just your team or your system in, these, very intricately connected businesses.
Makes sense again. And Ross, are you back with us, sir? Okay, we do not yet have Ross, so let's see what the audience actually voted. Let's see how close we are. So, interesting. We have a little more of an evenly split set of answers here. We have a tie, actually. A tie between C, the one that the hard to answer or ask cross-functional questions, is tied with no shared understanding of how data connects. So the panel was good on number 2, but it was tied with number 3. And coming up, a significant drop below that is differing definitions and terminology leading to inefficiency and confusion. And almost no one chose the lack of ability to test hypotheses. So that was not a popular option here today. Let's just turn for a moment to some audience questions. We've just got 4 minutes left here, so let's take a look at one. One of the audience members is asking, what are the requirements? And I'm going to just initially throw it over to Andrew. What are the requirements for managing all different kinds of relevant data in one place to be able to efficiently query it? The questioner says it seems pretty daunting to have to be able to house data from sales, financial operations in one platform. What is your take on that?
Yeah, from a Looker perspective, Looker is in database. So if we want to connect this information up, kind of based on the last poll question, we would kind of need this information to live kind of all in the same database. When it comes to managing that, it's not actually, it's kind of builds itself organically. People start asking questions, and then the analysts that understand the data from these different verticals will start modeling it. And they'll say, okay, I want to actually just look at some sales stuff, but I want to pull in finance as well and some operations and stuff. Modeling is super, super easy. And so as we start going in there, the analysts that actually understand their data sets will start to model, start to build those hooks and those connectors inside of Looker. And when I say it builds organically, it's kind of this idea that you don't go in and you just build everything all at once and then it's suddenly working. The idea is that your data and even your mindset on how information is going to change over time. And so we start with asking questions, and you start building these kind of environments, which we call explorers, in order to answer those types of questions. And then you can pivot and create a new one based off new information, maybe even the same type of stuff, and you can kind of dispose of your old model really easily. But the idea here is it's kind of an ever-growing and changing thing. So it's not something that we build once, we set it and forget it. It's something that's kind of always evolving. And in that, I don't know if it answers directly as far as managing it goes, but I would say managing that kind of ever-evolving type of thing is probably where the pain point lies. You just kind of have to have some due diligence there. We do have the ability to kind of we integrate with GitHub Looker itself. So the idea here is that if you actually create a piece of code, you can check to see was the last time somebody adjusted it. You can push it to other analysts to make certain they can check it and say, oh, okay, this is legit. This one's good. We can actually push it. And then those subject matter experts in those different kind of verticals here have the ability to go in and kind of clean stuff up as they go.
That's excellent. No, I appreciate it. That's very helpful. We've got to wrap up because we're getting the signal we're about to go off the air. Just wanted to wrap up a couple of quick items here. One, MobileBeat 2016. We're asking if everyone can join us in San Francisco in July for MobileBeat 2016, where we'll be focusing on AI, bots, and mobile innovation with speakers from Google, Facebook, Uber, Airbnb, Slack, and a bunch of others. We're giving viewers of this webinar a 10% off discount. You'll find the link in the attachments for their tickets using the promo code webinar10. So I wanted to thank very much our guests today, Ross Bixler, Robert Olson, Andrew Searson, and John Sefentes. Thank you, everyone, today for attending today's webcast, Power Up Your Analytics, brought to you by VentureBeat and Looker. You'll again be able to listen to this webinar on demand by going back to this location. I'm Evan Schuman, signing off for VentureBeat. If you enjoyed today's conversation or have suggestions for different kinds of content, please rate this webinar and tell us what you think. We take these comments very seriously and are continually striving to bring world-class content to VB Live. And now, a few words from our lawyers. This webcast is copyright 2016 by VentureBeat. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted, if that's the case, by VentureBeat and Looker, who are solely responsible for its content, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. Thanks so very much for your time, and have a great day.